There's another conference coming in a month to London called QCon, and this year, very excitingly, they've added an ethics track, and I'm kind of piloting the content for that. I think that we're a really young profession as computing, right? We're not the stocking stitchers of old. We don't have a lot of experience. And we've got a lot of issues in our industry with the talent and the professionals, and you'll understand why I put that in quotes in a little bit, that are kind of missing out on the concept of ethical processes in their software development. And it's incurring what I have coined as an ethical debt problem in our industry. So before I dive in, I'm Theo Schlossnagle, Postweight on Twitter. I'm founder of Circonus. We do big data stuff. We're hiring. Everybody's hiring. I also participate heavily in the ACM. The ACM is the largest and oldest professional society for computing. It's the Association of Computing Machinery. That gives you an idea of how old it is. It has about 106,000 members. They focus on professionals and academics. And I'm pretty active there, mainly because I see some problems that I can't fix from within my company that I think are really pervasive throughout the industry, and we need kind of a bigger hammer and different tools. So, and if you don't recognize me today, it's probably because I looked something like that at another time. I try to go in disguise everywhere I go. Disclaimer here, big problem with giving an ethics talk. It would be horribly unethical of me to present an ethics talk with the implied expertise of an ethicist. I am not an ethicist. So all of my ethics were consulted with ethicists. I talked to a couple philosophers in the construction of this, and I talked to a couple of computer scientists in the production of this. What I really wanted to happen was an ethicist to come talk to computer scientists. After talking with the ethicist, now I do not want that to happen. It was incredibly difficult to translate and apply. So I'm doing my best to kind of put all of those things together. Another disclaimer is that this talk has many more questions than it has answers, and that is the intent. So what is ethics in the first place? So it's about systematizing and defending a recommended set of rules around right and wrong. It's pretty easy. That's what ethics are. And if you go back, I don't know, in the previous presentation, or two presentations ago, I learned that you actually have a decent education system in Britain. So you may actually have exposure to ethics in your primary education, so non-university education. We tend to not have that in the United States, as is evident by our fucking industry right now. So that's a huge problem. In fact, you can get a university degree without taking an ethics class, which is a travesty. So if you go back to early philosophy around ethics, you look at things like you've got Immanuel Kant, you've got John Locke. They really tried to structure a framework for discussing ethics that we now classify as deontology. And deontology is the ethics around duties and rules. And then there's another, not opposing, but another framework for discussing and evaluating ethics. It's called consequentialism, which is the ethics of the consequences of actions, not the actions themselves. You know, it's ends and means and all sorts of different things. They actually all end up in the same place because we tend to universally agree about wrong and right, unless they get really, really sticky, and then we agree that it's complicated. They're really just different lenses through which we can look at these problems and justify why they're right. So it's like philosophers. They don't actually say anything new. They just figure out a different way to say something old. So a relatively new kind of approach, and it's certainly not new from an idea, is virtue ethics. And it's just the ethics of the virtues themselves, like, you know, being honest, right, as an ethic. Doing good for, you know, being magnanimous, like being generous, those sorts of things as ethical values. So those are the basic three lenses. If you do any research online, almost everything will be deontology-based, because most of the published works are that, and that's how we think in Western thought. So you won't find much consequentialism, and it'll be thrown in there. And virtue ethics is almost absent. But they're important constructs. So the problem with virtuous behavior is that nobody's perfect, right? We're all fuck-ups. So the idea is you need to understand practical wisdom to be able to apply ethical principles, right? The difference between knowing what's right and wrong is very different for someone who is 60 years old than it is for someone who is 12. And in fact, the decisions can be very different, right? So these are kind of some basics of ethics. Another thing that's incredibly important to remember about ethics, and I think a lot of people lose sight of this, is that they only exist within the context of human society. Ethics are about what humans think of as right and wrong. If we're not here and we blow ourselves up, ethics go away. Ethics are a human construct, and they apply to the behavior of human beings. They don't apply to, you can't say that a dog is unethical, right? It would be a mislabeling. The other thing is that they dramatically change over time with globalization, with scientific understanding, and supernatural belief structures, and all these things. They've changed. And that's okay, and we want that, right? As our human society changes, the ethics with which we use to kind of process the actions that we do, they change, and they should. A great example of that is, medicine. So, Hippocratic Oath. Anybody know, when you think of the Hippocratic Oath, what do you think of? First, do no harm. Not actually in the Hippocratic Oath, which is amazing, right? First, do no harm. It's actually kind of second in there, and it's not do no harm. It's not exactly what it says. It really says that your job there is to make someone better or leave them the same, and you should not do things that would cause like untoward outcomes. It also says that you should apply your medicine to slaves as well as non-slaves, which is implicitly saying slaves are all right. Okay, that's a little odd. And it also has kind of a line in there about abortion, about not assisting a woman with causing a miscarriage. And our societies have changed a lot since Hippocrates did that. Those two things in there in most modern societies, those things are just like, okay, well, that ethical construct, general oath is okay. Let's move on from these two things. They think that the health of the patient is more important than that. So it's important that those ethical constructs don't stay stuck in 430 BC or whenever they came. So it wouldn't be a monk event without monks. So one of the oldest, the first applications of ethics were for clergy and monks. So the problem is if you've got a direct phone line to God and you're talking to people about it, there's something really important that you have to do. You have to convince them that you're telling the truth, and you have to convince them that you really do, and you have to use it in the right way. They have to know, from a societal standpoint, that you are going to use this magical connection to God for the benefit of society. So one of the first professions that adopted ethics was the clergy. In fact, the word profession has a root word profess, which was professionals, right? The professionals of clergymen. So the word professional came around the concept of a pious job. So it's kind of an interesting thing there. Immediately after that, medical, it's like, don't fuck me up, all right? When you come in, don't assassinate me. It's kind of like the barber's rule, don't cut my neck. Doesn't matter if I'm a jerk. So those things are really important. They establish trust with a medical professional, and the reason is they're up in your business, right? You don't want somebody with their hands all up in your business and prescribing things that you potentially don't understand without full confidence that they have your best interest in mind. So there are two industries that have that. So we start to apply ethics to everything, right? And ethics in general, there's a general framework for ethics and right and wrong and everything like that. The reason that there are all of these things is that the type of ethics that apply in medicine when you're actually treating someone for an illness or prescribing medicine or performing surgery is slightly different than the one that you would do in business and doing a business transaction, a deal, an employment contract, right? They're not different concepts of right and wrong, it's just they're very, very specialized domains, and which is why we have domains and we study them and everything like that. So business ethics are there, which I wish more people, I think a lot of people know about, I wish more people actually were ethical about it. And then there's professional ethics. And I think this is one of the problems that is just, ethics in computing is one thing, which we're going to talk about, but professional ethics, that is what it means to be a professional. That's what separates being a non-professional, an amateur, from a professional is the ethics. That's what makes you a professional. So if you're a professional computer programmer, professional software engineer, and you don't have ethics, you're not a fucking professional. That's how it works. So that professionalism comes with ethics, and they are very, very important. So computing in particular has a different set of domain-specific ethical concerns. And the reason why it's so important is because, like I said, it only exists within the context of human society. Why does, probably bookbinding probably doesn't have a domain-specific set of ethics. It might. I could be wrong. But the reason clergy did is because clergy touched everyone, because at the time everyone was religious, and they had an interface with all of society. They had an enormously wide influence. Medicine, everyone, unless you're in the United States, has access to healthcare, right? So medical professionals end up touching such a large swath of society that they need to set up a set of ethical constructs so that societal relationship stays intact. The reason computing is in such a dangerous predicament is because 40 years ago we thought that there would be like 1,000 computers in the world, and only 6 companies would need to run them, and it was okay, right? And it turns out that that's a little off. It turns out that probably in 20 more years, there will be no individual human being on the planet that ever that can do their life. They can't do their things without a computer. It is fundamental to the fabric of society now, and it will become inextractable from the fabric of society going forward. It is here, and it requires not only a social construct, but an ethical construct, an ethical pact between software developers that are building this fabric and the society that it serves. It has to serve the society. That's the important part of ethics. So, some examples. These fucking guys. All right, so the VW emissions thing. So it turns out that a group of engineers, and it went up from there, a group of executives. And it turns out that when you work at a company and you build a product and you actually intentionally, ethically violate something, it's impossible for it to be one person. Unless you're like espionage. If you're a spy, if you're a KGB agent or CIA agent, maybe you can pull it off as one person. It takes a community, right, to actually fuck up this bad, right? So the team designed the fuel emissions system to behave differently during emissions tests so that they could pass the test. And when you took it off the testing machine, it behaved completely differently and had much worse emissions, right? It was intentionally designed to skirt the laws. Turns out that breaking the law is unethical, right? I think people don't realize that, right? Breaking the law is unethical, and we do have screwed up laws in a lot of places, and that's a system problem, right? But those the constructs that are law are what keeps society operating correctly. It's what allows human beings to trust each other, that there are laws that we all agree on and follow. And there's punishments and consequences for not doing it. So, and I'm not going to go into why that doesn't always work all the time, but these fucking guys. All right, so somebody actually ended up in jail for this. I just don't understand why it was one person, right? There should be also every engineer that knew about this and didn't whistleblow on that should be excommunicated from the profession. Shouldn't be allowed to write software anymore, in my opinion, right? If you are a lawyer and you go, fuck your client, you get disbarred. You can't practice law. That's how it turns out. If you are a medical professional and you give horrible medical advice that violates the Hippocratic Oath, guess what? You're not allowed to practice medicine. In computing, it's like, oh, dude, I'll just go to this other startup and hack. It's cool. That's a big problem. All right, these fucking guys. All right. So I was telling somebody, I have 6 examples, I think, and I was like, God, I could use Uber for every one of them, but I'm not going to. That would be funny. Oh, sad, so sad. So greyball, if you're not familiar with greyball is an application that was designed as a theming application that allowed you to make Uber look like your favorite football team or something like that. So if you were in Seattle, you could get like Seahawks pictures on the cars, and it allowed them to change the map layout, change different cars that participated and didn't participate. It was specifically designed, targeted, and deployed to law enforcement officers so they had a different view of what Uber was doing in a city. It was its only use. Like, that actually doesn't break the law. It's completely fucking unethical, right? So that's important to know that breaking the law is unethical, but you can still be quite unethical without breaking the law. So greyball was designed by an engineering team with intentionally nefarious purposes for misleading law enforcement to avoid regulations. Because those fucking guys also intentionally ignored the laws about autonomous vehicles in San Francisco City and had their autonomous driverless cars operating in the city, running red lights through crosswalks with pedestrians in them. Intentionally. There's a letter inside the company that says, fuck them, we're going to disrupt this baby. Right? That's crazy. Like, how many engineers had to get that car on the road? It was a lot of engineers that were all complicit in that. And that's just absolutely unacceptable, right? And it's a sustainability conference, right? My biggest fear with this sort of ethical construct in our industry is that we sustain, right? We stick around and keep doing this shit, we're going to unmake everything. It's really, really scary. So, technical concepts, they're only one of many. Hand soap dispensers. This one is much more interesting, and this comes to software. This is a hand soap dispenser that does not fire for African American dark-skinned hands. Only fires for white hands. All right, so that's tragic. You now have a technically, I don't think you can have a racist soap dispenser because racist is a term applied to humans. You can't have a racist dog either. It can just be a dick, right? So this is interesting. It would be racist developers of software. But racism actually doesn't necessarily require intention, but they had no idea. They had no idea that this was a problem, right? And then when they found out, they were like, oh, shit, that does not work. You do not read the comments, I'm telling you. If you find this article, it'll make you blow your lid. Do not read the comments. But it's a pretty interesting case of a piece of software development that uses a lot of different technology components where there were certain ethical questions that were not asked during the process of development. What are the ethical questions that you should ask? Who will this help? You should always ask yourself that question. If the answer is nobody, perhaps you should invest your time elsewhere. It doesn't make it unethical. Who will this disenfranchise? Who could this hurt? Right? And this is just a case of disenfranchisement. Just a case of disenfranchisement. They add up a lot, right? But the problem is that the sample set for QA in this didn't include any black people. Didn't include any Indians. Yes? It was non-deliberate, completely non-deliberate. So it was an omission of it was a QA failure. Yeah. So there's certainly it was certainly not malfeasance, right? So the question is whether it was negligent or not. And the problem is because we don't have strong professional and ethical constructs in our industry, it's not really negligent either, because let's go build some software, right? I mean, that's actually totally acceptable. So it completely complies with what we're doing. And then another one that's really interesting now is another emission. So, and there's been a lot of news, and military bases can fend for themselves. So it's like who not to pick on. Oh, the hot map right there. And, Strava, they build like a Fitbit style tracking app for runners and bikers. And it's global. So your data is anonymized, right? The trail leading from your fucking house is anonymized, right? Great. Okay. Yeah. It could be anybody coming out of my driveway. The problem is that the reason it hit the news is that people were able to identify which army bases were active and where they were because there were really hot run trails from all the military personnel. They all tend to fall in line, turns out. So the real problem that I see with this is that it allows you to figure out how fast the person is on the bike and how long the ride is, which gives you an disturbingly accurate number for how much they paid for their bicycle, and you know where they left their house. You know where the bicycle is, right? It is an absolutely amazing theft phishing tool, right? And it was all just due to hey, this product feature would be cool, without asking the question, who could this hurt? Who does this put at jeopardy? Whose privacy could this violate? So those are the things that we're looking at, right? So there's a lot of anecdotes, and like I said, I could have actually done every example with Uber. Though at this point, I'm actually skeptical that any of their fuck-ups were not on purpose, because they just seem so rotten from the inside. And I know some Uber employees that are great, right? It's just that you have to have such an epic, well, we already know it was rotten at the top, but you have to have an epic chain of command failure for something as complicated as an autonomous vehicle to get onto the road. People build the vehicle, write the software, they're looking at the footage, they know that they ran the red lights, it's a bug report, you got a JIRA ticket that you broke the law. I mean, 3 or 4 different ways, right? It's crazy. And it's amazing to me that an organization that large would be complicit in that. And it just shows that the personnel that are we're looking for talent. Everybody's looking for talent. I'm looking for professionals, right? And that's the big difference, is that we need to start treating our industry like it has the impact that it does, right? It has enormous global impact. It will impact society. You've got Facebook and all of their bots that were able to influence the U.S. election, right? I mean, weren't able to get a popular vote, but it was kind of crazy that platform didn't contemplate the consequences of that, and still doesn't really own up to those problems. And whether it affected it or not is not actually the point. It's the ethics of it that's more important. So, is this really my responsibility? It's funny. Another anecdote was someone asked me, what are you talking about tomorrow? And I was like, I'm talking about computing and ethics and computing. And they're like, is that what you do? We should all be fucking doing that, right? Yes, aren't you doing that if you're in computing? You're talking about being a human being. Is that what you do normally? Okay, yes. So yes, it's your responsibility. That's the end of that. So I think the really important part here is to start the conversation, right? And ethical. If anybody's been in business and ever had to fire somebody for behavior issue or performance issues, they'll often sue. At least in the U.S. they do. It's the litigious country in the world, right? So somebody goes and chugs a keg and verbally assaults a client, and you go, you're out the door. You'd hope. At Uber, I think that you get hey, that didn't go on tape, did it? Usually you get fired, but then there's this problem that they're going to sue, and then you have to deal. Do you litigate? What do you do there? You're handed two probable outcomes. So you're handed two paths. Both of them are unethical, and you have to make a choice. This is why you have deep constructs for processing ethical actions, right? Because those decisions are very hard. You're often faced through no fault of your own into a situation where you have several paths to choose from that are all shitty. And you have to choose the right path, right? And you have to choose the most ethical path, even though some of them are all below zero. So that's really interesting. And it's about asking questions. So when you are writing code, and the reason we have so much debt in this industry, I don't care so much about 20% of the source code not having licenses on it. I have a problem about 20% or 100% of the machine learning frameworks out there that know that they have bugs that can affect outcomes for their uses and things like trying to decide whether or not an individual recommit a crime, right? They have issues with the frameworks, and they are not properly disclosing the possible consequences of using those frameworks in applications, right? And so ethics needs to float all the way up, right? If you're writing a C library, honestly, your ethical disclosures are probably pretty small. If you're writing a crypto library, it's kind of interesting, right? You do have ethical consequences for the type of code you write and the type of algorithms that are there. There should be disclosure about how much privacy you should expect from this, right? All of those things. Those are ethical concerns. So asking questions is really important. I have a link at the end, but the ACM has an ethics policy, and if you want to understand why things should change over time, in 1992, that was when it was written. It's very old, it's very outdated. They're expecting to release a new one this year. It's been in the 4th review now. It will be released in 2018. I think it'll be pretty decent. They are starting an Ask an Ethicist program at the ACM. So it'll be an online column where you can actually just write in and say, I got asked to do this, anonymously. What should I do? Is that okay? Which is great. And what we need to do is really consider what are the ethical implications of doing X when you're doing X. At every turn, when you're maintaining code, and when you're working with other developers, and when you're hiring, all of these things. So we need ethics in our profession. And these are a whole bunch of links. I'll share my slides online, but get some ethics.